So my goal of this developer comparison is to determine which developer will give my film the most pleasing grain that I'm after. Not all images need to be fine grained, and it's my opinion that they shouldn't be. Film grain is one of the defining characteristics of film, and it's really what the negatives that we love are made up of. The texture and grit film grain can add to the feeling of an image is quite remarkable. Remarkable to the point where I'm really getting quite obsessed with grain in my images, and at least when it fits the subject and the mood of what I'm trying to actually print or make. And this is not a test of different films, just two developers, and this is to keep the variables down. And from there, I'm gonna adjust and test additional film and developers as needed. So same film, same scene, same exposure, two different developers. For this test, I used Fomapan 400, and I've found this to be quite a grainy film, and I actually really enjoy it in 35mm. Plus, I have a bulk roll of it, and it makes it easier to shoot a few frames without wasting any film. The two developers I tested are Rodinal and HC110. Now, right off the bat, I do have a few assumptions towards each of these developers. My feelings are that Rodinal will produce sharper images and sharper grain. And I also assume that HC110 will give me slightly more pleasing tones. My last assumption is that I will generally be pleased with either of these developers and this film and developer combination. However, I have never done a controlled direct comparison, and I'm very open to being proven wrong with any one of these assumptions. Now for the test shots, I used my Canon EOS 1V with 100mm macro lens, mounted on a tripod, and also used the mirror lockup function to eliminate any mirror vibrations. It was really quite miserable outside, so I ended up taking the test shots of an orchid we have out on our front porch, and it was lit by some very large windows that we have out there. My feeling was the white of the orchid would work well for the grain, as it will render high levels of density on the negative. In essence, more density, more grain. The one thing I wish I had done different as far as testing would have been to stop the lens down and shoot an additional frame with more of it in focus. Having more of the image in focus might have helped make a better determination of sharpness between the two developers, but overall not what I was testing for, so not a big deal. Now, I did choose to shoot these at f4. The lens is very sharp at f4, but when shooting at a very close distance, it creates a very shallow depth of field. I had decided that that's really what I wanted for this image, even though this was a test. I have a hard time testing just for the sake of testing, and ultimately wanted to make a nice print that I would enjoy out of this. So the other benefits of the shallow depth of field is basically to see the grain rendered in like out of focus areas and tonalities, which often looks quite nice, and I thought it might be useful in determining a clear winner. Once the images were shot, I developed them both in my darkroom using the same stainless steel tank, and I kept all the variables such as temperature, agitation, and things like that identical. I also tried keeping the dilutions fairly similar and aimed for a similar contrast in both sets. The Rodinal was used at 1:49, 21 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, and the HC110 was used at 1:39, 21 degrees Celsius for 12 minutes. I was making more of an educated guess with the Rodinal, and indeed the highlights were not quite as dense as the HC110, but I felt it was close enough to make a fair comparison. So ultimately, I decided I wanted to see these printed in the darkroom on photo paper. I did, however, scan them first, and I actually used the same 100mm lens on my Canon R5, converted them in Lightroom with Negative Lab Pro, and then with that I did apply the lab sharpening in Negative Lab Pro. As you can see here, they both look quite nice, and it's difficult to see any difference in contrast in the scans. Here is the Rodinal scan. Here is the Rodinal scan at 100%. The grain is very crisp and very sharp, as you would expect from Rodinal. Now here is the HC110 scan. And here's the HC110 scan at 100%. The image definitely appears softer to my eye and the grain not as defined, but I do find the grain quite nice. So from the scans, overall, I feel I like the look of the Rodinal grain better, and overall, I like how both of the image look in general as far as tonality goes. So as far as the scans go, I would definitely give a slight win to the Rodinal. Next, let's see how things pan out in the darkroom. One of the reasons I decided to do this comparison, as some of you know, and as in my previous video, I added a condenser enlarger to my darkroom. This will by nature give more pronounced defined grain in prints made with that enlarger. So using that enlarger, I printed both an 8x10 and then raised the enlarger all the way up to do a max enlargement in a cropped area to give kind of a closer view of the printed grain. Now, printing these in the darkroom is where I really noticed the difference in contrast. I developed the HC110 how I normally would for my dichroic enlarger, and sure enough, it was too contrasty in the condenser head using a number 2 filter, and I had to print the HC110 negative with a number 1 filter. Now, the Rodinal negative printed quite well with a number 2 filter, so my development for that was right on. And I also now have a really good gauge for these developers and this film when I want to print them with this enlarger, which I do plan on doing in the future. So that is just an added bonus. So when I compare these two prints, I really like the look of the one developed with HC110 print better, just overall. It's a little smoother and in general, it fits this particular image better. However, I still like the Rodinal and how it printed. It looks great, and the grain definitely has a crisper look to it. Now, when I look at the 4X crops, I like the look of the grain in the HC110 developed image better as well, and I was really quite surprised by this. Now, all of this is very subjective, and to be fair, there's not a huge amount of difference in either one. The biggest difference is gonna be in sharpness, and I feel the Rodinal is a winner in that area, like for sure. So in conclusion, I did overall, as far as the darkroom prints go, I like the overall look of the HC110 print better. But I do strongly feel that has a lot to do with just the softer nature, this being a flower and kind of having a softer focus all around. I feel that the HC110 just lended itself better to that. Now, I think for a grittier, say, street scene or something like that, I would absolutely most likely prefer the grit and the sharpness of the Rodinal. But most importantly, this really solidifies my notion that film developers they don't make that big of a difference when it comes to the final image and how successful it is. Now, it does make a difference, but not nearly as much as good composition, lighting, and other elements will make. Now, on the other hand, if you like your images to be like as grain-free as possible, then it makes complete sense to use like a staining pyro developer to mask the grain. But short of that, pick a good developer and stick with it, at least for a bit, so you can get consistent results with it. For me, in my 35mm film, I think I will continue to use both of these developers. Just depending on what I am shooting will kind of determine which one I use. So I do hope this comparison was insightful, and I will see you next time.